this is the Provoked Prawn here with a detailed guide on the Corsair 6500X. I'm going to show you how to build in this case with a rear connect motherboard and Corsair's iCue link system so that you can create a really clean build that looks something like this. Here I'm using a number of interesting parts and I'm going to show you the wiring and setup process for them. But first of all, I want to mention that I'm using Asus's TUF BTF motherboard, which is a rear connect motherboard which allows you to have all the ports on the back. This is also interesting because it also has a connector for a rear connect graphics card. More on that in a second. But you'll see that this case and this motherboard are designed to work nicely together in some ways, with a caveat that I'll get to in a minute. And as you can see, you can basically end up with it looking like this, sitting in the case with no connections on the front apart from one cable, which I'll show you in a little while. This is set up alongside this rear connect graphics card, which is a 4070 Ti Super from Asus, the TUF Gaming version of this. And this is a special one because, as you'll see, it has its connectors on the opposite side, so you don't actually need to plug any power cables into this because it gets its power from the motherboard, which is interesting in itself. This is fairly unique and relatively new and also really clean, and I really hope to see more of this style of graphics card in the future because it ends up making the build really hassle-free and straightforward. And it has this simple little connector here which runs alongside the standard PCIe connector, and that plugs directly into the motherboard in a really simple way. Now, I'm going to show you all the detailed wiring for everything in this and the setup process for it, and I'll leave timestamps down below so that you can jump to the relevant parts. And if you're going to use different GPUs, don't worry, because I'll cover that as well. But as you can see, this one just slots into place really simply and looks the business when set alongside this motherboard as well. So it's a perfect pairing. It looks great. And if you want to take it out, you just got this little nifty lever on there, which you can do to remove it. Sadly, though, you won't be able to use a vertical GPU mount in this setup, so that's one thing to bear in mind. The other thing I want you to keep in mind is with the rear connect motherboard, the connectors on this plug in at the back, and there are some problems with this case. Firstly, it's not very user-friendly because if you need to access the two 8-pin CPU power connectors, you first need to remove the hard disk drive cage, and you also need to remove the power supply in order to do that. So think about that during the build process. This cage has a hole in it, which means the cables can stick into there, and these jut out. And as I've shown in a different video, if you then try and use a hard disk drive in that cage, you'll come across a problem because you might end up shredding the cables like I've done here, exposing the metal wires. Not ideal, so I'd recommend not using that bottom slot, and we'll get to that a little while later on. But as you can see, the finished product does look very nice. So now we're going to rewind a little bit, and I'm going to start from the beginning, taking the case apart and showing you how to do that and the things to think about along the way. This is a nice looking case from multiple angles, as you can see, and it is able to be built in a variety of ways. It also has a number of accessories that you can purchase afterwards to upgrade it and change it. So it's worth having a look at that if you're curious. There are extra panels, for example, that you can get. But it also has some interesting and easily removable parts. This top panel just pulls away relatively easily. Other reviewers have noted that there's bends quite badly, and I have seen there is a little bit of a bend in mine. As you can see here from the shot, it's not perfectly flush with the top, but it does have a nice bit of dust filtering on it, so it should allow for some good clean case use over time. There are also some interesting designs in the door here. You'll notice the way it hinges into the bottom and sticks in there. You have to sort of push it at the top and the bottom to fully close it, I've found. Something to bear in mind. But also, if you want to remove it for the build process, which I highly would recommend doing, there's a screw at the top left corner that holds it into place. So I'd recommend unscrewing that and then setting that aside, obviously taking care not to lose it during the process because you will want to replace it when you're finished so that the door stays on and doesn't come away. But you can just take the whole thing off and move it out of the way, which makes building a lot easier. You'll see when you do this that there is a little shelf at the bottom there, and that's how it pops into the case and is held in place there with a couple of notches to hold it in place. Pretty solidly designed in a number of ways and flexible, but just be careful with that top panel when you pull it off because it is easy to bend. I'll also pull out that bottom dust tray and get that out of the way. You'll be using this obviously to keep the bottom of the case clean, but you want to move it out of the way for installing your fans. You can also remove the front glass panel, and this can actually be swapped out with an airflow panel if you prefer. But what I'm doing here is removing it from the case so it's easier to build in. So with a couple of screws undone, you just lift it towards the front, turn it slightly, and then pull it out. There's 3 hooks down the side which hold it into place in the case. We can then set this aside so it's out of the way. The rear panel is held in place with 2 thumb screws, and once you take that off, you obviously have access to the back. But one thing of note, you'll notice this back panel has a dust filter built into it. It also has this plastic tray here, and I think this is in place to basically stop the filter on the inside from getting caught up in the fan blades, which is a problem I saw with a 2500 case. And you'll see that it's kind of flexible and might be easy to accidentally pull that out. It's not that easy to see on camera, but this basically sticks out a little bit. It's a bit of a design flaw there. It's something to watch out for, that you don't tug on that too hard and that nothing catches on it during the build. Then you'll see that you have access to the rear here. Now this case is obviously capable of taking a standard ATX motherboard and a rear connect motherboard. I've done a separate guide on a standard motherboard setup if you want to see that, and I'll link to it in the description. But here I'm going to focus on the rear connect BTF motherboard setup because that is the cleaner design here. Quick point of note, you'll see that we have the front panel connectors here that includes 2 USB-A connections, USB-C, HD audio and front panel. Now most motherboards don't have 2 USB-A connectors on them. If your motherboard like mine doesn't have it, then you won't be able to use all 4 USB-A ports on top of the case. Something to bear in mind. I've not managed to find an adapter which will work with this, so that is a problem. Now I'd recommend removing the hard disk drive cage entirely if you're doing this build. But in there, you'll find that there is an accessories tray and obviously the 2 bays. On the side here, you have 2 SSD trays as well, which you can use. Now, if you're going for NVMe SSDs, you'll have a much easier time here than you will with hard disk drives and SSDs, as I've already shown. That cage gets in the way of the rear connectors and presents a problem for your power cables. There are various different areas that you can tie your cables down at the back, but it does prove tricky with that rear connect motherboard as well. The cage for the hard disk drive can be removed with 2 screws, but you do need to lift it up because it has some little catches on the bottom, which is why it's a problem with the power supply unit once that's installed. But if you can see, you strip the whole thing down, it's much easier to access. I'm going to quickly show you how to install the drives though, if you do want to do it, because that will be useful for your reference if you're thinking about installing SSDs or hard disk drives. And you'll find the little accessories tray is separating out the different screws, and you can easily do that. You'll also find a cable included here, which is basically not necessary for most cases and won't be in this instance with a front panel adapter for special motherboards. So for a hard disk drive installation, you'll find these little plastic cages basically hook over the hard disk drive, and then you have 4 screw holes where you screw your screws into it to secure it further. So it's actually secured in 2 different ways, and then you screw into the 4 points here. Obviously, we could still use 1 hard disk drive or 1 SSD in this tray because you can use either in there, and that is the nice thing about these trays. And here it is for demonstration purposes where you'd set up and install those. Keep in mind the direction the connectors are facing, so copy me here. If you're going to use these, we want to face the connectors to the other end of the cage, away from the clips at the front. That way they'll be pointing towards the right direction for the power cables and the data cables to pass through into the case really easily. As you'll see though, it's much easier to use those little cages that I showed you a minute ago for the SSDs, and it'll keep things out of the way. And hard disk drives, you basically can only install 1 if you're using a rear connect motherboard. So food for thought maybe there. Ideally, neither of these in the cage. Instead, use the SSD tray here, and these basically mount onto the cage itself on the outer side. Put them face down so that the connectors face towards the bottom of it, and then screw them in from behind, and then this notches back into the cage. It's worth noting that I actually ended up using 1 drive on here. You could theoretically use 2, but what you'll find is this is actually quite useful, the cage that it sits on for the controller for the iCue Link system. The other thing to note is that the fan tray here on the side is removable and you can actually reposition it. So you can take it out. So as standard, it's set right back flush against the back of the case. You can flip it around or you can just maneuver it forward into a second lot of notches that are a bit further into the case. Now this is useful later on, as I'll show you, for mounting a radiator onto it, because it means that you can have more space at the back, which is useful if you want to do a push-pull setup, which is one of the things I'm going to show you how to do here if you're curious and you want to do the same. So for this build, I'm using Corsair's RM Shift, the RM1000X modular power supply unit. So I'm going to show you the wiring for that and the setup of each of the individual cables. This power supply, as you'll see, might not be the best one to use for this build actually, but it was what I had, and I do like the cables on it because they're quite thin, they're easy to manage. It uses Type 5 cables, and it has a 12-volt high power connector for your graphics card, and obviously a sufficient amount of power for the system that we're building. So it is quite nice, but the cables become a bit of a problem later on. Nevertheless, I'm going to show you the connectors we're going to be using and the cables that you'll need if you want to do the same, and alternatives if you're, for example, as I said, using a different graphics card that requires power connectors. So let's just go through this stage of unboxing it and setting it up. I've done a separate wiring guide on this, which goes into a bit more depth as well that you might find useful. I'll link to that in the description, but you can see it here with all the cables laid out, and then we're going to go about the build process for this. You're also going to see a couple of other power supplies just for ease, but we're going to start with the 24-pin power cable, which is for the motherboard. Now, this is split into 2 parts on the power supply unit end. You'll notice this is Type 5 connectors on one end as well, which means they are smaller cables, so you can only plug it in one way. You won't be able to plug the other end in, so you can't get it wrong because they're smaller connectors on the power supply than they are on the motherboard. And here is another power supply just to demonstrate slightly different view. But the 24-pin power connector goes on the rear of the motherboard, obviously on the left-hand side on this BTF motherboard. Plugs in notches on there and connects up. Now, obviously, you do this once the whole system's in place, but I wanted you to be able to see really easily where these connectors are so you can get an idea of it, and then I'll show you in the case later on. Then we have the 2 8-pin CPU power connectors that plug usually on the top left of a standard motherboard. On this motherboard, obviously, it's slightly different. These plug into the PCIe/CPU connectors on the power supply end. You'll notice they're marked Type 5, and then they plug into those ports there that you can see near the motherboard part of it. And then they'll plug into the top right of this motherboard at the back of it. And they have little hooks on them which will catch onto the top of the ports, so you can only plug them in one way round and make sure they're fully connected. If you have a different motherboard that has a 4-pin CPU power connector, you can actually split these CPU power cables in half, and then you can just connect half of the cable. So you might find your motherboard has one 8-pin and one 4-pin, for example, and that's the way around that with these cables. Now for the SSD power cables, you'll find these flat SATA power connectors, which plug into the SATA/PATA ports on the power supply end, and then have this daisy chainable cable on them that allows you to plug in multiple drives with one cable. So you plug them into the SATA port here, and then you have these connectors which easily connect up to, for example, this crucial SSD and to the hard disk drives as well. There's an L-shaped connector on it, so you have to make sure you've got the notches the right way around so that it'll easily plug into the connector here. And if it won't go in, that's the reason why you could just flip it over and round. And it's the same for your hard disk drives. And as I said, you can connect up multiple drives with a single cable, which makes life pretty easy. You can also use these for other things. So if you're not using iCue Link like I am, they're quite often used for fan controllers. For example, for Corsair's Commander Core, you'd use one of these, and for other fan controllers as well. In terms of the data connection, there's a cable that comes with your motherboard, which runs from the SSD to the SATA port on the motherboard, and that in this case is in the bottom here. So you can see there's 4 SATA ports. You plug your drive into that once it's fully installed in the case, And this is just so you can easily see those connectors. I'll show you again later on what it looks like when you plug it in when you're in the case, but I want you to be able to easily see how to connect all of these up. So you could just plug your drives in there. So obviously you can connect up 4 potentially to this motherboard as an example. Now for the graphics card, I'm going to start by showing you standard GPU wiring. So if you have a standard GPU, you might be using these PCIe power connectors. You'll see you have multiple cables here. So on one end, they're marked Type 5. On the other end, they're marked PCIe. Here we have a 3090, which requires 2 8-pin PCIe power connectors. So you'd require connecting up 2 separate cables to this graphics card that will then allow it to be powered properly. And you need to make sure the power cables are pushed in when doing this as well. So the power cable is split into 2 parts, a 6-pin and then a 2-pin connector. You need to push those 2 together and then push it into the graphics card. It's really easy to accidentally have the 2-pin part of this not fully seat in, and then that could lead to problems where you're not getting enough FPS. The GPU is just underpowered and not working properly, and that might be that. So plug one end into the PCIe/CPU power connector end on the power supply unit, and then the other end into your graphics card. You're going to need 2 cables here, but obviously you've got multiple cables included with the power supply. So if your GPU requires 3 or 4 power connectors, then you can plug these in as well. And note that these will also be used for Corsair's iCue link setup. Alternatively, you have the 12-volt high power connector, which has 2 power cables on one end, and then this 600-watt power connector on the other end, which is for NVIDIA's 40 series GPUs, and that will plug into your graphics card and give you sufficient power without the need for those horrible adapters that come with your GPU. You can plug the 2 cables into the PCIe/CPU power connectors on the power supply end, and then the other end plugs into your graphics card. In this case, a Gigabyte 4070 Ti. You just slot that in to the port there, making sure there's no unnecessary tension, bend, or pull on the cable when it's plugged in, so that it's nicely seated and secured. Now on this motherboard, things are slightly different because you're plugging in the power cables directly to the motherboard itself. You can see it's got 3 8-pin PCIe power connectors or 1 12-volt high power connector. So you can plug the standard cables into the motherboard itself, those 8-pin PCIe power connectors, or you can use a 12-volt high power connector. So it depends on what power supply unit you're using. And if you're using the same one as me, you can just use the 12-volt high power cable in place of those 8-pin PCIe power cables. You can plug that in and then you'll have enough power for your GPU on the front. Now I'd recommend plugging in all the cables that you're going to need for your build before you try and install the power supply unit. This is especially important in this build, as you'll see, because these connectors face towards the top and are blocked by the hard disk drive cage if you left it in place. They're difficult to see, and it would just be awkward to try and plug these in afterwards. So based on what I've shown you and what you know you're going to be installing, make sure you put the cables in beforehand and then go about the installation process, putting that power supply in place here and securing it with the hexagon screws at the rear. You'll see that I've cable tied some of the cables, and then I wanted to re-secure the hard disk drive cage because I'm a numpty and I forgot that I was going to have to plug in the 8-pin CPU power connectors here. But basically, I want you to see my mistakes so that you don't make the same errors. If you do this, you'll have to remove it again so that you can plug in those power cables to the back of the motherboard, and it just becomes fiddly and awkward and messy, so it is a real hassle there. So get rid of the hard disk drive cage, plug those cables in, tidy the cables up as much as you can. This is especially important, as you'll see, for a rear connect motherboard, because you need to get those cables out of the way of the various different holes that you can see at the back where the power connectors and the other connectors are going to be passing through and sticking out. There aren't a great deal of places that you can tidy these cables away. I found that I was tying cables to the loops, but also tying cables to each other just to keep them nice and tidy and out of the way during this process. Now we're going to set up the motherboard and install the parts in there so it's ready to go in the build, because we need to, for example, set up the cooler as well. And so we're going to start with the NVMe SSD installation, in this case WD Black SN850X. This is a PCIe Gen 4 drive, and you can install multiples of this drive or of these sorts of drives on this motherboard. I'd recommend using the top slot. That's normally the fastest. I'm going to do a separate review testing this and showing off the various different parts of this motherboard. But under this top heat shield up here, you'll find there's one M2 port, and there's some others underneath for the larger shielding down the bottom that you can unscrew as well. The drive slots in really easily, clicks in here, and then is held down with a small clip on the other end. Don't remove the sticker, you don't need to, and I've shown in other tests that it actually pays to leave it in place, but you do need to take that blue sticker off the heat sink to expose that thermal pad and then put that back in place, because these can actually make quite a difference to the thermal performance of your drive. For the installation of the CPU, we're just going to lift the little lever here, pull back the latch, gently insert the CPU, watching out for the little plastic notches on the bottom, carefully lowering it into place, putting the latch back down, and then it should see the little plastic cover pop off. Secure that down there, and then we're away. Now for the DDR5 RAM installation, you want the second slot and the fourth slot, which are conveniently marked in grey instead of black here. Pop your RAM into those two slots, and that will ensure that those run correctly and at the right speeds. If you use the wrong slots, it won't work properly, so make sure it's the second slot and the fourth slot, and then that's set up for the most part. Now we're going to be using Corsair's iCue Link H150i RGB, which you can see laid out here. I'm going to do a separate guide on this and the iCue Link system, but I'm going to talk you through the wiring and setup here. This all-in-one cooler makes life more convenient and theoretically much easier than Corsair's traditional coolers, because these fans are very intelligent and they also cable into the radiator, and there's no cables coming out of the pump head, which means it fits wonderfully with a rear connect motherboard because it looks really nice and neat. You'll see that we have pre-applied thermal paste here as well, and you can even twist the Corsair logo around on there and take it off completely because it's only held in place with magnets. It's worth noting that this is actually modular as well. Corsair's released a little fan system that you'll be able to pop on top, which I'm going to do a video on soon, hopefully. And you can pop that off and replace it with something else, which I'll show you in a second. So it's modular and interesting. You can also buy a display version of this. But what's interesting here is the cabling. So the iCue Link system, if you don't know already, essentially includes these little cables, which allows you to daisy chain things together. So we connect one cable from the fans to the radiator. This small cable here plugs in from the fans that are on there to the radiator. And then there's another cable that connects up to this black control box. So this little controller is able to control up to 24 devices, 12 on either side. It has two connectors on it, one on the right, one on the left. You can plug in 12 devices on either side of it, which is nuts. So you plug the other end of the cable into the radiator. That's then controlling the pump and all three fans, as well as the RGB on the pump head as well, from that one controller. You can get a white controller that comes with the iCue Link fans that I'll show you in a second. And I just wanted to demonstrate this because this has three connections on it that you'll need to be aware of. So as well as those cables that plug into either side, you have the PCIe power connector that I mentioned earlier on. So this adapter plugs into the bottom here, and then you have a 6-pin power cable that needs to plug into this. That's the same power cable that you use for your graphics card. Then there's a micro USB cable that plugs into this and then needs to be plugged into your motherboard, and then that will allow you to control the system via Corsair's iCue software. And then for the cooler, there's an additional small cable which plugs in on the right hand side here, and then that connects up to the CPU fan header on your motherboard, which you can see the cables laid out here to make life a little bit easier as a reference. So those are going to plug into 3 different points: power supply and motherboard, so that everything can be controlled by Corsair's iCue software and easily seen within that. So this is a reminder that the power supply cable from your power supply unit for your graphics card is the same cable you use here, but instead of pushing it together with the 8-pin connectors, you split it open so that you've just got the 6 pins and that plugs in there. Obviously, you're going to need to make sure you've got enough of these cables. If you've got a GPU that requires 4 PCIe power connectors, you might have a problem. If you've got the same setup as me, it won't be an issue. But this is the basic wiring for that. You connect up to your motherboard, to the CPU fan header, to the power supply unit, and then to the USB connection as well. So you can see the CPU fan connector on the top of the BTF motherboard, and at the top of most motherboards is where it'll be located as well, and then the USB connection at the bottom, which is really important to plug this in, otherwise iCue won't be able to see it, and then you won't be able to control the devices from iCue. So that's one thing. Next is making sure the motherboard's fully set up. I'd recommend doing this now, makes life easier, but we've got this back plate for Intel motherboards where you need to push the 4 corners out on the back plate so you can adjust it through the holes on the back of the motherboard. And then there's a double-sided 3M sticker there, so you remove the tape that covers the top, and that will help secure this back plate to the back of the motherboard and make sure it doesn't move around too much. So just pull that backing off and then flip your motherboard over and stick this through. Now you can do it in the case, but I find it easier to do it when it's outside, not just because it's easier for you to see, but also because it's just easier to access in general and to make sure it's fully attached and to put the standoffs in. So you're pushing that through so that the standoffs push through to the other side, and obviously that the sticker holds the back plate in place properly. And then you flip the motherboard back over and you use the standoffs. But what you'll notice is one of the holes here isn't lined up properly. So the top left one here hasn't lined up properly with the hole on it. And that's because this motherboard actually has 2 lots of holes so that you can use a LGA 1700 or LDA 1200 socket all-in-one cooler bracket for this, which is confusing, but basically you need to make sure it's out to the 4 corners, and then you're using the 1700 socket standoffs that are clearly marked on the bag with the cooler. Then you can see them here, they're the same size on either end, so you just screw those into those 4 bits that are coming through from the back plate that you put in place earlier. You just secure those down, and you're basically prepping the motherboard so that it's ready to receive the cooler once we've mounted it all in the case. Make sure they're fully tightened, each of those though, before you go about installing it. The other thing that I'm doing here is I'm using the LCD upgrade kit. Now it's worth noting that you can get a cooler with a display on it already, but if you haven't got that, you can get this upgrade kit, which essentially is just this display that sits on top, and it works with iCue Link's system to then be able to display GIFs, temperature readouts, and other things on there. I've done a separate video on this, but then you also need a USB connection to the all-in-one cooler as well later on. So just quickly show you the logic. Obviously we've got one cable connected to the controller. This is controlling the pump, the display, all 3 fans, and they're all basically connected, daisy chained into the controller in this way. Fairly simple. For the rest of this build, I'm using Corsair's RX 150i RGB fans. This is the starter kit, which includes 3 fans, the controller, some connectors, screws, and 2 cables. You can daisy chain these fans together naturally and connect them up and then control them via Corsair's iCue Link software. And as I'll show you, you can actually mix and match them with the fans on the cooler as well. So any of Corsair's iCue Link fans can be set up. But these are more affordable fans, so they make for an interesting alternative. It comes with a similar controller to the one that's included with the cooler, but you won't necessarily need to use this, depending on how you do your build. I end up just using one controller, but I want to show you the wiring logic for it. So for example, we've got a group of 3 fans here connected up to a controller. It needs to be connected to the USB header on your motherboard and to the PCIe power on the power supply unit. And that would be the standard connection for those fans. If you buy a single pack, you get the fan and a single cable now. You didn't used to get a cable, so this is a nice addition. And obviously some screws as well, and the connectors. So I would recommend, if you're copying my build or doing something very similar, get 2 triple packs and then some single fans. The reason for that is you make sure you get enough cables, because you get the longer cables included with a triple pack. as well as the shorter cables. The shorter cable is perfectly useful for connecting and daisy chaining fans together though, and that's the idea. So for example, if I use this as an exhaust fan at the rear of the case, as I'll show you later, you can connect one cable to that, and then the other cable connects up to another group of fans, which in turn then connects up with a longer cable to the controller or to the all-in-one cooler, for example, as I'll show you. So it's really easy to daisy chain these things together, and as I said, you can have up to 12 devices on one side of the port, so you can really easily group multiple fans together. But 2 triple packs will make your life a lot easier here. As you can see, you can do something like this. You can have 3 fans connected to another lot of fans, connected to one port, and then connected to another lot of fans. The system is really straightforward and easy to use. So with the cooler, obviously this comes with the Corsair's QX120 fans as standard, which are the fancier version of the fans. These are nicer iCue Link fans. They're more expensive though. And I'm taking them off in this instance because, as you've seen already, I'm mounting the radiator and setting it up so that we have an intake set up. So we're pulling air from the back of the case through the radiator to cool it down. I've found this is actually the best way to do it. This fan setup also includes temperature sensors on each fan, which is why these are more expensive. But if you want to, you can flip them over to achieve the same results that I'm going to. So intake through the radiator to keep it cool. I've done a video separately on where the best position is for your radiator in your system, but this is what I'm doing, and you'll see the results of it in the review of the case if you subscribe. Now, you can alternatively replace the fans that are on there with the RX 120 fans, and I'm going to do that because I want to have the same uniform look throughout the case. I want to make sure I'm using the same fans across the entirety of the case. This might seem illogical because I'm swapping the high quality fans with the cheaper fans, so you probably wouldn't do this, but I want to show you why I'm going to do it, because I'm going to use the QX fans on the other side as a push-pull setup later on. So you can swap the fans out and then plug them in the same sort of way that they were connected already. So you just connecting those up, and then I'll show you the full wiring for that in a little while. So now installing the motherboard in the case, now it's fully ready with obviously the bracketing ready for the all-in-one cooler. Set that down on the standoffs that are already pre-installed, and then you've got 9 screws to screw through in there, 3 across the bottom, 3 across the middle, 3 across the top. Secure that, make sure those are all screwed in, that will hold the motherboard in place. And then we need to plug in the power cables that I showed you earlier on. So you've got a 24-pin power connector that plugs in on the left-hand side here. You can see it's a little tricky to access, which is why I said it was so important to cable manage earlier on. You want to make sure all the cables are out of the way so you can easily plug these things in. Then we have the USB-C cable, which is for the top of the case. And you can see USB-C and USB-A here on the left-hand side of the motherboard. They'll only plug in one way, both those cables. One's got a notch on it, the other one you'll hear click when you push it in the right way. Don't forget though that there's 2 USB-A connectors, and there's only one connection on this motherboard, so something to bear in mind. The front panel connector plugs in the bottom left here, on the left-hand side of it, and you can see the way that plugs in because it's missing one pin. So just pay attention to that because you can only plug it in one way around, but it's on the far left that plugs in there, and that's for the power cable. The audio cable plugs in on the right-hand side. That's for your 3.5mm jack. So the F audio panel in this case is on the right-hand side. Plug that in, same sort of logic. And then the 12-volt high power cable for your graphics card connection that I showed you earlier. Don't forget that as well. Plug in all those in. So this is that connector for the GPU power. Easily plugging in all those things. What isn't so easy is managing and tidying these cables up, so I had to use a lot of cable ties for this. As I mentioned already, don't forget you need to get rid of the hard disk drive cage in order to plug in the 8-pin CPU power connectors up here. What I ended up doing was plugging those in and then trying to tie them down. Now the advantage of this power supply unit is the cables are quite thin, so it's reasonably easy to tie these cables down and get them out of the way, neaten things up and also have it look good. And you can basically do that quite easily. Just watch out for that hard disk drive problem that I mentioned earlier on. Then remove that radiator tray from the case because we're going to mount the radiator to it. and then put it back in a second. So I'm going to mount it so that the tubes are at the bottom of the radiator. And as Gamers Nexus explained, you basically want to make sure the pump isn't the highest point in the system. And we're going to install that here and basically put it in so that the radiator is going to be facing towards the front. And then what I'm doing here is I'm going to use some RX fans as a push-pull setup. I will actually swap these for the QX fans in a minute, but I wanted to show you how to do this so you could basically put your fans in the same direction. Use the radiator screws that are included with the cooler because they actually supply enough to do push-pull. Push them through the fans, through the tray and into the radiator and secure those down. This will then allow you to just basically put the radiator with 6 fans back into the case and you'll have extra cooling. It is possible to do this if you want to. So this is a nice way to do it because it means you can put the RX fans on the front of the radiator where you'll see them, and then the QX fans, as I'll show you in a minute when you swap them out, on the other side. So you can basically still use the high quality fans, but also the other fans so you can maintain the same aesthetic. But it's important to make sure the fans are facing in the same direction. So the blades are facing the same way so that air's being pulled from the rear through to the front. Now, obviously, you can connect them together. So you see we've got the 2 connectors here. So you run one of those short cables from one set of fans to the other so that those cables are connected together. And then as a reminder, the ones on the front are then connected to the bottom to the radiator, and then the radiator is connected to the controller. So this is basically daisy chaining the fans together, connecting it all up so that it will all work nicely. You can see that here, got cables on either end, but once you install it in the case, those are basically hidden away quite nicely. So with the radiator sorted out, you can pass it through from the back. You'll notice that there are a couple of feet at the bottom that you basically need to notch into the holes there. Watch out for the cables at the bottom as well. Those obviously need to pass through to the back. But you need to put it at the inner part here because obviously with the fans on the back, you can't put it right at the back where it's originally installed. You need to push it more forward towards the front of the case and install it on that secondary bracket there, then put the screw back in place. One thing to note that I'll show you in a second is you need to make sure as well that the radiator is pushed all the way up to the top on this bracket because I actually found there was a problem with mounting the bottom fans that I'll show you in a second. Before we get to that, I want to point out the way I've mounted the radiator. A lot of people like to put tubes at the bottom because they're worried about air bubbles getting into the pump over time. So having tubes at the bottom of the radiator can stop this as long as the pump isn't the highest point in the system, which it isn't in this case because the top of the rad is. But you can see on one of the tests here essentially what this looks like, whether the tubes are going to stretch, whether they're going to interfere with anything, how it's going to look, what the impact's going to be on the graphics card placement, because in a previous build I did in a different case, it really caused problems with pushing right up against the GPU. This is obviously going to vary depending on what graphics card you've got, so it's worth testing beforehand. In this case, obviously with this rear connect GPU, we're going to plug it into the motherboard and see how we fare. As you'll see, this actually works out quite well, but I'd suggest it might be worth testing with your own graphics card if you're using something different to work out whether it's going to be a problem for you. The longer the card, the more of an issue maybe, but what I found actually is the tubes fit quite nicely behind this graphics card when it's placed in the motherboard, as you'll see in a second. The benefit here of doing this, of course, is it allows you to test beforehand because you don't want to get to the end of your build with the CPU block fully installed and obviously the thermal paste has then been applied and then you have to remove it and maybe flip it around because that would cause bigger problems. So it does go over the end with the tubes basically at the end of the graphics card, but there's also a big enough gap that you can push it behind the GPU and it will sit back there. And what I've found is this doesn't put any unnecessary pressure on the graphics card. And it's also not going to cause problems, I'm pretty sure, in terms of the temperatures interfering with each other and with issues there. It also doesn't cause a problem with blocking the RAM as well. So now we're confident about that. We can pull the plastic cap off of the CPU block and then install it over the CPU itself. So basically carefully placing this down. Note I've got the tubes on the right-hand side here. and we're putting this down over the top of the standoffs we put down before, and then you use the 4 thumb screws to secure the cooler to the CPU. Go corner to corner, so from one corner to the opposite corner diagonally, and I'd also recommend using a screwdriver to make sure these are fully tightened up across each of the 4 corners. Don't over tighten, just screw until it won't go any further. Don't force it because you don't want to damage anything, but you do need to make sure this is secured nicely, otherwise it might not cool as effectively as you'd like. And then once that's done, you can see that's secured nicely into place, and this is the final result of that and how it looks. I don't think aesthetically it's as nice looking as it would be if the tubes are at the top, but it still does work. Next up, we're going to install the controller, which I'd recommend just taking that SSD tray off of there if you're not going to use it and putting it up here. I found this is the sweet spot for this installation. It's just about the right distance. The USB connection on this isn't very long, it's worth noting, and obviously don't forget to plug the power in, but the USB obviously has to stretch to the bottom of the motherboard. There aren't many other places that you can put this really, unless you perhaps just dropped it at the bottom of the case. But what I found is that one cable is potentially an issue. It is slightly magnetic, that controller, but you do get some stickers if you want to secure it fully into place instead. So the long cable that's coming from the bottom of the radiator from the front of the case is running through here and plugging into the controller. As a reminder, that the front fans are then plugged in to the radiator and the back fans are plugged into the front fans. So all of those things are connected together to this controller on one of those ports. Then plug the PCIe power in, the USB connection and the CPU fan header to make sure everything's connected up fully. And that's obviously just the radiator for the cooling for that. But we need to make sure all these cables are fully connected. So don't forget that CPU fan header cable, which weirdly is on the front of the motherboard. So this is the only connector on the front side of the motherboard that you need to plug in and that be visible, which is one small downside to what is otherwise a nice system. I'd recommend doing a test boot at this point just to make sure these fans turn on and the display works and everything else is set up nicely. One of the things that I noticed here, for example, is that I forgot to plug the USB cable in that is required for the display. Also, the fans aren't lighting up properly. The reason for that is actually because the firmware needs updating. So for the controller, historically, you could only plug 7 devices in per side of the controller. So there's actually more than 7 at the minute, which is why the fans aren't lighting up. So you need to go into Windows to update the firmware on the controller via iCue. So the fans on both sides are working, but the lighting isn't. If you see the same thing, don't panic. You just need to go into the Windows first to update that. So as long as the fans are spinning, it's fine. But you do also need to plug in the USB connection from your motherboard to the bottom of the radiator so that the display will be recognized properly in iCue, and you can adjust it to show the various different temperatures and other things that you'd want to on the pump head. This black cable runs to the bottom of the radiator and plugs into the USB-C port down there, and then the other end plugs into the motherboard as I've shown you. These connections will then hopefully ensure everything works nicely. At this point, I'm reinstalling the GPU. I only took it out really so you could carry on with the rest of it and you could see clearly what to do. But you need to remove the 2 PCIe brackets that are in line with the PCIe slot on the motherboard. And then obviously slot the graphics card in as I've shown you, making sure you're putting it into that top slot so that the power adapter lines up with the top one on the motherboard as well. We're going to seat that back in, push it in until it clicks in place, and then on the left-hand side you have to re-screw in the little screws that hold it into the back of the case. These are a little bit fiddly and quite small, so I'd recommend using a screwdriver to secure them rather than trying to use your fingers. And then once that's secured, you can then just maneuver the tubes into whatever position you want, whether that's just over the edge like I had them initially, or tucked in and nestled behind them. It's up to you, but it's worth experimenting with those a little bit and then setting it up the way you want before you're carrying on with the build. And then we can boot it up again. So this is actually after I've gone into Windows, just to show it demonstrates it. And I'll show you what to do with that later on when you get to that stage. But go into Windows, update the firmware on the controller, and then all the lighting's now working, as you can see, on the fans, on the display, and obviously on the GPU as well. I mentioned earlier on that perhaps the more logical thing to do with this setup would be to just use the fans that come with the radiator itself. Instead of putting push-pull fans with the RX 120 fans, you could reuse the fans that are already included with the system. Now, the good news here is this makes it more affordable and perhaps a little bit more logical, although obviously the fans might have slightly different specs in terms of airflow capabilities. But if you're trying to save money and you want to copy what I'm doing anyway, then you can reuse the standard fans, but instead of mounting them on the front, you mount them at the back. That way they're out of view and you can maintain the same aesthetic throughout the front, but you can rear mount these fans. And they will still daisy chain into the system, so they'll work alongside the RX fans that we're using. Talking of which, we're now going to use another group of those fans on the top for exhaust fans. So face the fan blades downwards into the case, and these will then be pulling air from the case and exhausting it out of the top. One thing to bear in mind here is when you're installing them, you need to think about the way the connectors are going to work. So you only have a connector on a certain side of the fans. You can see where they are in this logic, for example. They're both on the side closer to me, closer to the edge of the case rather than the back. We're going to use the standard screws that come with them, or these also come with a case and as an alternative, and then mount them to the top. These fans are then going to be wired in by using the small cable that comes with the single pack to connect them to the rear exhaust fan, and then a cable on the other end to connect to the controller. So I just want to show you the logic for that and the process for it. We're going to install those, and then you need to think about the cables. And this is why I recommended getting 2 triple packs, because you get 2 of these longer cables included. And we're actually going to need those for the way we're doing this. Because as well as that, I'm also using this long cable on the bottom fans. So these fans are set face down in the case, so they'll be pulling cold air from below. And then the long cable from that stretches through to the back. Now, the one thing that I've had a problem with here is I couldn't put those 3 fans in without ensuring the radiator was pushed all the way up on the tray. So make a note of that. If you have a problem, it might be because the radiator is not far enough up, because the tubes were getting in the way of the 3 fans and I couldn't then install them on the bottom of the case. But once that's done, you can then get them down there. Otherwise, you can't screw them all in. So that's something to bear in mind. Just make sure that's pushed up and out of the way, and then you can sort it out. Then I'm using a single fan as an exhaust fan, which is going to connect up to the rear. This small cable that comes with a single fan plugs into the side there, and then plugs in to the other group of fans at the top. So mount that at the back and work out which way around you're happy for the cable to be when you're installing it. And I'd recommend plugging them in first before you go and installing the fan into the case, and then seat it in there. Obviously, with the Corsair logo on the side, you'll have more lighting, but perhaps you want to hide that cable away a little bit more. So I've chosen to nestle it away like that by just turning the fan round and then screwing it into the rear. The screws that come with the fans screw in really easily, much easier than your standard screws. So they only require basically 1 or 1.5 turns to screw in, which makes life really easy installing these. But the idea with the wiring makes it really straightforward, because obviously you can see we're daisy chaining one to the other, and then you get the long cable that you can see here, plug that in and then run that towards the back. So you can then plug these fan cables in really easily and connect them up using just one controller, assuming you daisy chain the fans together like this instead of trying to run multiple cables through to the rear. But what we're going to do is, with the bottom 3 fans, the long cable that are connected to those, I'm going to run through to the back and plug in to the fans that are mounted on the radiator. That means that you've got 6 fans on the radiator that are connected together onto the radiator and then to the controller. And then you've got another 3 fans that are connected to that group from the bottom. The top fans, so the 3 exhaust fans on the top and the 1 exhaust fan at the rear, are then connected via the long cable to the controller like this. So you have essentially 2 groups of fans all daisy chained together, connected up to the controller and plugged in. And so it's fairly straightforward, as you can see there. And you still have space to install an SSD if you want to on that tray, and in theory an SSD or a hard disk drive in the cage as well. But as a reminder, just use the top slot. Don't try and use the bottom one, because you might damage the cables while doing so. And then we need the SATA power cables that I showed you earlier. Find that, plug that in to the drive to make sure it's powered, and the data cable as well that will run from that through to the motherboard port down on the bottom left. So yes, the cables are getting a bit messy now, as you can see. Cable tidying in this case is not easy. So here's my shame on full display for you to witness. But you can plug those in down the bottom and then try and work out how you can neaten things up yourself. If you can do a better job, good for you. But I haven't managed to, and I'm going to be stripping this case down at some point to rebuild other things. So that's why it's a complete mess. But you can see, once it's all set up and powered on, that the rear fans are working and the front fans are working. And this is one of the nice things about iCue Link now, is that you can actually integrate the system so you can have multiple different things connected and you can daisy chain them in. The fact that the QX and RX fans will work together and are recognized in iCue, as you'll see in a minute, makes life a lot easier to set it up and also just do things like this. So you can maybe make it a bit more affordable or accessible, or just, you know, set your system up in a variety of different ways. I'm quite happy with how this build's come out, but stick with me because I'm going to show you how to install Windows, what to do in iCue, and some other things to keep in mind for your build. But let me know what you think with this. And if you want to know about how the performance has gone with it as well, subscribe, because I'm going to do a full review on the case where I've set it up in a couple of different formats, tested it out, and shown you other things that are possible with it. So subscribe if you haven't already to see that. But now we're going to put everything back together as it came apart. So obviously putting that rear panel back on, notice that the fan clips that I showed you earlier on are still there, so they'll stop the fans from touching the rear. But there's plenty of space with it mounted forward anyway, so it's not a problem. Then resecuring the front glass, which is a little bit tricky because you have to put those hooks in and then angle it round. So you're like closing a door and then screwing the two screws in at the top and the bottom to make sure they're fully secured in there. And then you'll want to pop the rest of the things back on as well. So obviously that top panel that I showed you earlier on, take care with this when you take it on and off. Obviously you'll want to remove it to keep it clean and tidy over time, but if you're removing it a lot, you might accidentally bend it. So just take gentle care when installing it, that you don't cause any issues with it, because I do think that could potentially be a problem in the long term. Then reinstalling the dust tray at the bottom, which in itself is quite fiddly actually, but notice that it pulls out from the front. So when you need to, you can pull that out and give it a clean. And then resecuring that glass door. Don't forget that you need to put the screw back into the top of that to make sure it's not going to come loose and that it's fully secured. So just screw that back in. Hopefully you've not lost that screw during the build process. And then we have a finished product, which I think looks really nice. I'm really happy how this has come out. It's not going to be for everybody, but I think the rear connect setup means that the front is absolutely really clean. It has a very nice cabling setup. Basically, very minimal cables are visible apart from the ones coming from the fans. Maybe you could tidy those up a bit. I'm seeing now, for example, the top cable on those top fans probably could have been tidied up a bit better. But let me know what you think. And then on to setting up Windows. So on a separate PC, search for the Windows Media Creation tool. And we're going to download the latest update for Windows 11 and install that. So there's a Windows Media Creation tool here, which you'll need a USB drive for. I've shown how to do this on your phone if you don't have a spare PC. I'll link to that video. And then you can just basically go through the process, use this creation tool to install it on a drive that it's external, and then you'll be able to plug it into your new PC that you're building and install Windows. So you have to wait a little bit of time for this to happen. But once it's complete, you want to take the drive that you've installed it onto, plug it into the back of your motherboard, and then turn the PC on. You should find that it then automatically recognizes there's a Windows creation drive plugged in. And then when it starts through the boot process, it should take you into the tool for installing Windows. You'll then need to follow the on-screen prompts to install the Windows relevant to your location. I'm obviously going for United Kingdom because that's time and format, and also the keyboard method, but you might want to choose other ones. Apologies for some of the focus on some of these clips, it went a bit wrong, but basically you want to go through the steps here. If you have a product key, enter it. If you don't, just click I don't have one. You can do that later on. Then Windows 11 Home, and then the installation for that, and just keep clicking through. We want to do custom install, so install Windows only. Click on that and then select the drive that we're using. Click new to create the relevant partition on that and set it up. And then just keep clicking next, go through and start installing Windows. Now, it will take some time to do this, And obviously we also need to make sure we get the updates once we get into there. But you go through, click that, and then wait, be patient. And then what you will find is eventually, once it gets to the part where it's about to finish, you'll need to unplug the USB drive that you plugged in for when it reboots. Otherwise it will try and use this again. So just once you get to the end of the process here, when it says it's about to restart, just keep an eye on it, because when it goes through that restart process, as you can see the bars filling up here, take that drive out and then allow it to reboot, and it should just reboot into the final stages of the Windows installation without the need for that drive. Once you're in Windows, head over to Corsair's website and download the latest version of iCue and then go about installing that. This is obviously important for those firmware updates and also to control it. When you first load iCue, you might find some notifications suggesting that it has new modules to download, and you'll need to restart the iCue in order to get those to work. You should also see there's an update available in terms of the firmware for the hub. As I mentioned, you can see this is leapt up quite a few versions from version 1 to version 2, and then make sure you update that for it to properly work. Once you dive into the Corsair's iCue software, you can also see both lots of fans listed in here. So you can see the QX and RX fans as well as the display. You can go into these and change the lighting, and you'll see them listed in there, and you can use the wizard to sort of work out where the fans are going to sit and the logic for that. You can also control the fan speed individually for each of these fans throughout, and choose from the various different options there. If you go into the cooler itself and you go to the fan setup settings in there, you can also tell it what fans are on the radiator. So you can see that it recognizes all the fans, but then also color codes them. So you can at a glance see which fans are on there. Now, obviously I know that the QX fans that originally came with the cooler are on there, but you'll see that the other fans are lit up with specific colors. So you can work out which fans in this list, even if you've got the same fans throughout your case, are actually mounted on the radiator. So you can tell it that for specifically for cooling purposes, not just for syncing the RGB lighting. Click through on there, assign those, and then just carry on running your system. Under the cooler, if you go into the screen setup section, you can choose what's displayed on the display in here. So you can actually select what temperature readout or what is displayed in here. So for example, you might choose the CPU package so you get an idea of the overall CPU temperature. There are a lot of different screen types to choose from. Obviously you could put a GIF on there instead, or a clock, or you could go for the dual bar setup so that you can see the temperatures of two different things at once. I like to do, for example, the CPU and GPU temperatures and color code them so you know which is which. So at a glance, you can see what the main temps are on your device really easily. So there's lots you can do within iCue in controlling the lighting, the display, and a lot more. Obviously, I'm just showing you some of the surface level things that you can do, but you can obviously go in and adjust the cooling and make sure it's running quietly and go through the steps in here. Now, hopefully you found this useful. I have done a guide separately on a different setup for this case with NZXT fans. I'm also going to do a review in the very near future, so subscribe to see that if you're curious about how the different setups performed and want to know more about the case. And let me know what you think down in the comments down below. Thanks very much for watching.
You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos, you might well find them interesting or useful, and most importantly, have a great life.